Back for some more Airtable action here. And let's do something that would allow us to quickly switch gears. So we know that Airtable corresponds to the script by, right? So what we can do is rename this temporarily to script UI. So, or WPF, it doesn't really matter. We'll be renaming it back again afterwards. And let's create new file script by print hello world, just to make sure that works. Yeah, that's the new one. So let's script all the behavior that we need inside of this file. It's going to make it easier. When we're done, we will refer back to it as a module or an external file. Right, so if at this point you can open your Airtable, if you don't have one, create a new account. It should be fairly straightforward. It's also free of charge. This is me starting on a new account. I don't have database just yet. I will create one from scratch. I will call it Revit. And the table would be called Revit Database. You can also change the color into anything you want now. Okay, let's do it baby blue. Baby blue is amazing. I will delete these guys. I don't need attachment, but I will add one more field, which will be the request. So we'll be taking the name of the person doing the request and the request itself. All right. So where do we start? What do we need to know? You can follow this tutorial quickly to familiarize yourself, or just to what I would do right now, and you will be all set. We would like to know how we can dip into the API of Airtable. So what we can do is say Airtable API documentation, and that would, if you're logged in, the first link will lead you to your own Airtable, and you can select the table, and that is already customized to your particular table. You have the ID, the base ID of the table, and all the examples that you can see below will be, for the most part, kind of structured around your own table. So here you see Revit database table. That's because we've named our table Revit database. If you were to rename this to something else with a typo, if I refresh in here, I will get on something else. Let me go back and rename that to Revit table with a dash, because it makes it easier. Right, so we have Revit table, and we have here a couple of examples what we need to do. Curl is just a way to execute web requests from command prompt or shell. What we need to do is this thing right here. So starting from HTTPS, API Airtable.com version 0, and then 2 separate fields separated by this slash. So this is our URL. Let's copy that out and go over to our py and just paste it in here blindly. You can, in Visual Studio Code, when you select everything and execute the quotation marks, it will wrap that whole sentence, string, or whatever it is inside of those quotation marks. So let's do that just for the time being. You will call it URL equals this thing. Fine. Now that was action number 1 for us to take. This looks like the first part of this URL looks like something very obvious, right? You have the HTTPS API Airtable.com version 0. That potentially is how every other, every single database endpoint or URL, starts with. Then when things get different for each user, you would expect is with this code right here, and then this version right here, this snippet right here at the end. Revit table, we now know that this is the name of our table. Going in here, that's what we called our table, that's the Revit table. So this is this thing. And in general, it's nice to have those as separate variables, because maybe you make changes, or maybe you place that in environment file. Then it's a good practice to have that as a separate variable. So let's make one. When we're speaking about global variables like those, we would like to capitalize them. So let's call this one Airtable underscore. This would be table name. Okay, and that would be this little guy here. Right, so our table name would be Revit table, and here we can swap this with the curly brackets and then format. Okay, then this illegible piece of writing is, we saw it right here. This is the ID of the base. So the ID of the base is really this thing, the Revit. That's the base. So basically this saying, go to Airtable, grab this base and grab this table from it. And so we make note of this ID, and in our code we can call that the Airtable base ID. That will be the base ID. And then we'll swap that out with this string. So now we have the Airtable base ID will come in first, and then the Airtable table name will come in second, and will basically be where we started. Okay, so this is the URL that we will be calling. Let's start with referencing all the namespaces and classes that we will be needing. Like before, we'll do a couple of import statements. Here we would like to get import JSON. We'll need a JSON at the end. You'll see where we'll basically Airtable expect a JSON message to go through, and we will wrap our whatever data we come up with in this JSON statement. Okay, so we also need an import CLR as always, if we want to add references, and then import system. Fine. With the CLR, we will add reference to system.net, and from system.net we would like to import web client, something called web client, and also something called HTTP request header. So we have the web client and we have the header, HTTP request header. Let's instantiate this web client. Now we have the URL or the endpoint. We would, going back to Airtable. So you can scroll down to create records and it would give us an example of how to do that. So this is a header and we would need those two. We'll copy them in a tiny second. We also need this data. So let's grab the data. Let's grab it just inside of the quotation marks. And let's make our own object that equals. This is a dictionary that contains a key value pair, records, and a list of objects. Fields is an object that would then have our important fields in here. So we would like to pass in the name and the request. So name, and mind you, this is capital name. We will pass in a name, something that will pass as a variable, and then request something that we will be passing as a variable. Okay, that's great. Now, this is the point where it's a good idea to create a method that would, every time we run it, it would be executing it. So let's define a method called make request. So make request with a underscore here, and it will take indeed name and request as parameters. Okay, let me arrange that a little bit more. So this is where we start, and this has to be the object. Yeah, fine. So take a moment to make sure your code looks identical to what you see here, because yeah, this is a little bit different than the example. We removed that second field's object. We are left with only one, and we added the names and the request field inside of the fields. Okay. We're almost ready to make a call now. So to make that request, we need two more things, which are defined right here. The authorization type is bearer with your API key, and the content type is the application JSON. So let's start with the content type first. I'll just copy paste that and take the part that I need, just copy it blindly somewhere. Now, let me show you what the end statement of making the request looks like. It will go something along the lines of client upload string, where we will paste the URL. So we'll provide the URL as a first argument and the data as our second argument. But before that, there must be a way for us to set this header information, and this way is indeed to say client headers, and we will be setting them up. So we'll call the header that we need, which will be the help, which will be the HTTP request header dot content type, and this content type would equal this. So this would be equal application JSON, and then something similar for, we can delete that, we don't need it anymore. Something similar for the authorization. Okay, only this time this is, instead of being content type, it's the authorization, and it would equal bearer your API key. However, obviously it's not your API key, but this API key is specific to us, to our database. So let's do the same thing that we did before. We will create a global variable for Airtable API key equals something that we will provide in a second, and let's replace that in the string below. Dot format, providing the API key. So we need to find somewhere the API key, and let me show you where that comes from. If you go back to your database and click on account and click on your account, you will, on the very first page, account overview, click on the API key and just copy that value and paste it in your code. This is me showing you how to make this run. Airtable only provides a single API key. So of course, be mindful what sort of Airtable are you using. If you have other databases inside, other tables inside. This API key effectively gives access to anyone with access to this API key to all your databases. So yeah, security, how are you gonna hide that key? Where are you gonna use it? That's something that I'll leave to you. But going back, just copy this key, paste it in here, and that should be enough. This should be enough. We can give it a go. We can try to run this code. If we have some syntax errors, pyRevit would let us know. Nothing. I've been a good boy and it works great. Now let me make this request with some fake name, John Doe, and some fake request. I have a request for you. And now if we run this code, okay, expected string got dictionary. And that's exactly where this JSON comes in place. Because this data, even though it has the structure of a JSON file, currently is just a piece of string or whatever you think it is, but it's certainly not a JSON. So we need to wrap it up and say JSON dot dumps data. Right, and let's hope this time it works correctly. We shouldn't see anything, and if we don't see any errors over at our Airbnb, we'll see a John Doe, I have a request for you. So let's delete those. Let's repeat that out. Yeah, here we are. So this button now executes this piece, this method directly. Perfect. So we made it work. We're now calling Airtable request from pyRevit. Now let's bring it all together and let's connect the UI, the user interface, with the request. Let me start by renaming this to, I'll call it web request py, and our earlier script, I'm going to rename it back to script py. So script py will be the script that is the one executing that whole thing. To make use of web request, where our method of creating an Airtable request is, we need to make another import statement. Obviously, somewhere here, I would say import web request. And because web request is in the same folder, Python wouldn't have any issues finding it. So I can, when I submit my form, I can simply say web request make request, and it expects the name and a request. Now the name, I haven't provided a way for the user to write their name, but that's because we're using Revit. We can automatically extract that information from the instance of Revit that's run at the moment, and still let me call that name. And then the request, we already know what it is, and it's self request. We can comment this too, and maybe, yeah, we can comment those two items out. Where is the name gonna come from? pyRevit has another very handy method called Revit 2_ is an object that gives you a reference to the instance of the application currently running, which has an object called the application. Sorry, that's the Revit, that's the application, and the application has a username, which should give us the username of your, or whoever runs this command at the moment, at the time of execution. So now this code will correctly pass in these two pieces and makes a request. So Airtable executed now should give us our old UI. I will bring Airtable back on and say, yeah, that's it. I'll give it a go. And perfect, it works. It grabs this long and silly piece of text that I provided. I have a different request this time around. If that's okay. Submit. And yeah, there we go. It works perfectly. It keeps going though, so it doesn't, I would expect normally that this window closes down after I finish submit. Click the submit. And this we can do in the code behind. After we submit, we can say something like self close, and this basically means me, the window, close me. It has a method called close, and it disposes of all the resources and all that, so it's a very good way of doing it. And now I think without make any changes, I can, no, okay, I need to save it out and I'm basically restart it. Okay, John Doe, I have a request for you. So every time I start, something runs. If I go back here, I will, and open my web request, I can see that this method that we use to test the code is still there. I can delete it or comment it out. By the way, let me show you that the client upload string creates a request, which request automatically gives you a response. And you can certainly print that response and see what you're getting, because if you don't get the correct response, maybe you capture a certain error here and so on and so forth. So save that out, go back to here and see if this time we close. There we go. And now the window is closed, and that's it. That's it for this tutorial.